It is much safer to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. The Prince, Chapter 17.
You crossed a line and didn't even realize it. The meeting starts like any other. Long table, water glasses untouched. You lay out your idea with sharp logic. Mid-sentence, someone cuts you off. You smile, adjust, explain it better. The air shifts, your jaw tightens, your chest feels tight. Your heart speeds up just a notch. The silence lasts a second too long. Eyes don't lock with yours, but they're taking notes. You try to show you weren't arrogant, that you weren't trying to dominate, that you were just contributing. And right there, a part of you dies. There's an invisible line that, once crossed, doesn't trigger an argument. It triggers a reclassification. You stop being seen as a force and start being seen as someone who needs to justify himself. And a man who justifies himself is a man who can be negotiated. The hidden game isn't about being right. It's about frame. It always has been. Every room is a silent courtroom. Doesn't matter if it's a meeting, a family dinner, or a conversation with a woman you want. There's a judge, there's an audience, there's a hierarchy floating in the air. The fatal mistake? Believing power comes from truth. It doesn't. Power is sustained perception. You've been in a room where you lost power without anyone raising their voice. You felt the energy shift the moment you tried too hard to be understood. You've noticed that the more you explained yourself, the less seriously you were taken. That's not coincidence. That's social engineering. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago. Jung explained from the inside what Machiavelli executed on the outside. You were trained to be morally defensible, but the real world respects the man who is strategically untouchable. Today, you're going to understand the line you can never cross, and you'll learn how to operate before you reach it. But there's a price. You'll have to let go of the need to look good. You'll have to tolerate silence. You'll have to let people think whatever they want, without rushing to clean up your image. That hurts, because it kills one identity, but it saves another. If you cross that line, you die socially. If you learn to see it, you become unreadable. And unreadable men aren't judged. They're calculated. Self-defense. The mistake starts the moment you try to prove you're a good person. There's an invisible line that separates presence from symbolic submission. That line doesn't show up in words. It shows up in energy. You cross it the exact moment you feel the need to defend your intention, not your outcome, your intention. That difference defines hierarchy. When you start explaining that you didn't mean to offend, that you had no bad intent, that you weren't trying to impose, you're implicitly accepting that you're under moral judgment. And the man who accepts moral judgment accepts a lower position in the frame. Machiavelli understood something most people can't handle admitting. Power isn't sustained by purity of intention. It's sustained by perceived firmness. A ruler who constantly needs to prove his virtue broadcasts structural insecurity. Structural insecurity invites testing. Moral self-defense is born from fear of rejection.
You don't want to be seen as selfish. You don't want to be seen as aggressive. You don't want to be seen as insensitive.
So you rush to adjust the image. But constantly adjusting your image communicates dependence on approval. Dependence is perceived weakness. perceived weakness lowers the cost of attack. That's the line. As long as you're defending results, you're in the strategic arena. The moment you start defending character, you've entered the courtroom. And in the courtroom, you don't set the rules. Jung explains this from the inside. The social persona is built for acceptance. When that persona feels threatened, the ego reacts with anxiety. The automatic response is to clean the stain, restore reputation, regain belonging. But every time you rush to restore belonging, you confirm that you belong to the group, and the one who fully belongs depends. The one who depends doesn't lead. Moral self-defense is always reactive. It never comes from strength. It comes from fear. You feel discomfort and try to dissolve it through explanation, but discomfort, when managed well, is a power tool. Machiavelli would never suggest eliminating other people's discomfort at all costs. He understood that a certain level of tension preserves hierarchy. When you remove any possibility of misunderstanding, you also remove your aura of unpredictability. And controlled unpredictability sustains respect. There's a brutal difference between clarifying and justifying. Clarifying is objective. Justifying is emotional. Clarification maintains position. Justification begs for absolution. Your body exposes the moment you cross the line. Your breathing speeds up. Your tone softens. Your speech gets faster. You start adding details nobody asked for. Excess detail is a sign of approval anxiety. Approval anxiety weakens presence. Presence is the ability to withstand judgment without rushing to correct it. If someone questions your decision and you immediately try to prove you're a good person, you shift the focus from the decision to your need for approval. And the need for approval is the opposite of sovereignty. Most men were trained to be morally defensible. Very few were trained to be strategically untouchable. Defensible means you can explain yourself. Untouchable means your position doesn't rely on sympathy. The invisible line is crossed when your priority shifts from maintaining structure to maintaining image. Image is volatile, structure is solid. If you hold structure, image adjusts over time. If you live adjusting image, structure never solidifies. Excessive moral self-defense also creates precedent. When you over-explain once, you set a pattern. People learn that by applying a little pressure, they'll get more justification out of you. Pressure becomes a tool, and you become exploitable. Strategic freedom begins when you accept an uncomfortable truth. Not every negative perception needs immediate correction. Some need to be tolerated. Tolerating occasional misinterpretation requires inner strength. But that strength creates density. Density creates respect. The man who doesn't rush to clean up his reputation communicates something silently. I don't depend on your absolution. That completely shifts the invisible dynamic. This isn't about arrogance. It's about refusing to automatically step into the role of the accused. When someone implies a moral flaw and you don't react with urgency, the frame hangs in suspension, and suspension creates uncertainty. Uncertainty forces recalibration. The application is simple. First, interrupt the automatic impulse to explain your intention. When you feel the urge to prove you're a good person, pause internally. Ask yourself, am I protecting the outcome or my identity? If it's identity, stay silent. Second, reduce emotional narrative. Short responses. Direct, closed. No excessive detail, no character defense. Third, accept that part of respect comes from the fact that you can be misinterpreted and remain steady. Stability under judgment creates aura. aura creates hierarchy. The identity that dies here is the man who needs to be understood to feel safe. The identity that's born is the man who holds his position even under discomfort. Never cross the line of moral self-defense, because the moment you try too hard to prove you're a good man, you've already given away too much power. In the social courtroom, justification is confession. Every social interaction carries an invisible field of judgment. It doesn't matter if it's casual conversation, a work setting, or an intimate relationship. Anytime more than one consciousness is involved, there is silent evaluation. Most men don't realize when they step into that field. They think they're just talking. But structurally, they're being classified. The fatal mistake happens when you accept the accusatory frame without noticing. It only takes a subtle insinuation, a doubt thrown into the air, an ambiguous critique. If your immediate reaction is to over-explain, you've already positioned yourself as the defendant. Excessive explanation doesn't communicate clarity. It communicates the need for absolution. And the need for absolution establishes lower hierarchy. Machiavelli understood that whoever accepts the opponent's terrain fights at a disadvantage. The social courtroom works the same way. The frame defines power. If the frame is judgment and you respond with justification, you've accepted the role of the judged. The core issue isn't the criticism itself. It's who defines what's happening. If someone questions your decision and you respond with a long narrative about intentions, circumstances, and emotions, you reinforce the idea that your legitimacy depends on collective approval. Legitimacy that depends on approval is fragile. Perceived fragility invites testing. There's a difference between responding and explaining yourself. Responding is objective. Explaining yourself is defensive. A response preserves position. A justification tries to recover value. When you over-explain, you unconsciously reveal two things. First, you're afraid of losing belonging. Second, you need to be understood to maintain internal stability. Both messages reduce authority. Jung would say this reaction comes from the social persona. The persona wants acceptance. When threatened, it activates rejection anxiety. That anxiety drives faster speech, excessive detail, and an urge to restore image. But every time you verbally try to restore your image, you communicate that it was shaken. And if it was shaken, your position wasn't solid. In the social courtroom, silence is a power tool, not passive silence, sustained silence. When someone implies fault and you don't react with urgency, you create a structural pause. That pause shifts tension back to the accuser. Without anxious resistance, the accusation loses fuel. Most people can't handle a vacuum. When you fill the vacuum with justification, you relieve the other person and weaken yourself. Whoever holds the silence controls the rhythm, and rhythm is power. Excessive explanation also creates predictability. If everyone knows that questioning you leads to emotional reports, you become easy to manipulate. Manipulation depends on pattern. Break the pattern. The strategic rule is simple. Never explain beyond what's necessary to sustain your decision. The decision is the fact. Your intention is irrelevant to someone who's judging. You don't need to prove purity. You need to sustain coherence. There's an even deeper layer. The man who constantly explains himself internalizes the role of suspect. Even without formal accusation, he starts operating as if he always owes justification. That erodes presence. Presence requires quiet confidence. Quiet confidence accepts that not everyone will agree, and it doesn't move to correct every interpretation. Machiavelli taught that reputation is built more on perceived firmness than on constant demonstrations of virtue. The ongoing attempt to appear correct diminishes authority's aura. Authority doesn't demand total understanding. Authority imposes structure. Practical application is direct. First, reduce your word count when questioned. The more pressure applied, the shorter the response. Second, eliminate emotional justifications. Don't explain how you feel to validate your decision. Third, when necessary, return the criteria to the other person. Ask what objective metric is being used. This shifts the focus from your morality to concrete parameters. When judgment leaves the moral field and enters the technical one, the structure changes, and you're no longer the defendant. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Some people test boundaries not because of the content, but because of the reaction. If your reaction is defensive, they learn they can influence your internal state. Influence over your internal state means power over you. A sovereign man doesn't hand over his internal state easily. He observes, processes, responds only as much as necessary. Constant justification creates noise. Noise weakens density. Density creates respect. The validation you're chasing will never come from the perfect explanation. It comes the moment you realize you don't need to convince everyone to maintain your position. Strategic freedom begins when you step out of the defendant's chair, and that happens the instant you refuse the frame of implied judgment. Whoever over-explains loses the judgment because he accepts being judged. And men who accept constant judgment live in permanent defense. Permanent defense doesn't build power, it builds survival. If you want sovereignty, abandon the need for absolution. Hold your position, and let silence do the rest. Jung reveals this. Your repressed shadow is costing you status. There's a type of man everyone says they like. Polite, available, understanding, always measured. And somehow, he's never the gravitational center of the room, social setting, mixed group, side conversations overlapping. You listen more than you speak. When you do speak, you soften your opinion. You avoid confrontation. You give up microspace. Someone interrupts. You let it slide. Someone disagrees. You explain it better. Someone teases you. You laugh. Everything looks harmonious. But something invisible is being recorded. You don't create friction. And where there's no friction, there's no tension. Where there's no tension, there's no elevated hierarchy. Jung said that what we repress becomes our fate. You repressed your legitimate aggression, not violence. Structural aggression, the ability to take up space without asking permission. From early on, you were taught that a good man is an easy man, that being agreeable is the highest virtue, that disagreeing creates conflict. So you learn to sand down your edges. The problem is, power comes from contour. Without contour, you become a flat surface. Machiavelli would never advise a ruler to be excessively good. He understood that unchecked goodness breeds familiarity. And familiarity without limits breeds contempt. Relationship setting. She tells you you're different from other men, that you're safe, that you're comfortable. You smile. But something inside you feels the absence of tension. She shares problems. You fix them. She complains about someone. You validate her. She tests a boundary. You understand. You become the safe harbor. But safe harbor doesn't generate electricity. And without electricity, desire fades. This isn't about manipulation. It's about psychic structure. The masculine shadow contains aggression, direction, the ability to cut. When you repress that to maintain the image of the good guy, your energy becomes predictable. Predictability lowers instinctive respect. Family setting, important decision. Everyone shares opinions. You internally disagree, but you soften it. You don't want to seem harsh, so you present your view as a suggestion, not a position. The final decision ignores you. Later, they say you never really stand your ground. See the paradox? You avoid friction to maintain harmony, and you lose influence. Psychologically, the human brain measures value through perceived resistance. What feels rare and firm generates caution. What feels abundant and flexible gets used. Excessive niceness communicates unlimited availability. Unlimited availability communicates low access cost. Low cost reduces perceived value. Jung would say this: when you project only light, your shadow shows up as weakness, not because you're weak, but because your energy is incomplete. An integrated man isn't one who eliminates aggression. He's the one who controls it. Machiavelli spoke about the need to appear virtuous without depending on virtue. You can be fair, but you cannot be hostage to the need to appear fair. Practical application 1, the micro-confrontation technique. Start disagreeing on a small scale. No raised voice, no over-explaining. Someone says, "That's how we've always done it." You respond, "I'd do it differently." And stop. Don't immediately explain. Hold the silence. Watch the reaction. You'll feel internal tension, anxiety, the urge to soften it. Resist. That's your presence muscle activating. Practical application 2. Reduce availability. Don't respond instantly to every demand. Don't accept every invitation. Don't solve every problem. When someone asks if you can help, sometimes say, "Not today," no long excuse, no report, no guilt. Right now, in the middle of this video, write in the comments, "I integrate my shadow." Repeat it mentally, "I integrate my shadow." Real validation doesn't come from being the most pleasant. It comes from being the most aligned with your own strength. Strategic freedom begins when you accept that some people will think you're harsh, and you tolerate it, because instinctive respect comes from the combination of moral predictability and strategic unpredictability. If you're always understanding, you never trigger alert. Without alert, there's no behavioral adjustment around you. And without adjustment, you become background noise. Machiavelli would call it perception engineering. Jung would call it psychic integration. You don't need to become aggressive. You need to stop amputating your intensity. Kindness that comes from choice is power. Kindness that comes from fear is submission. And most men don't see the difference. Every time you soften your opinion out of fear, of tension, you reinforce a pattern of invisibility. Every time you hold your position without apology, you recalibrate the environment. This isn't about dominating. It's about not being symbolically dominated. There's a line between civility and submission. Most men cross it without realizing. You won't anymore. Machiavelli takes command. This is where most men pull back. because the word fear triggers learned morality. Forget morality for a moment, observe behavior. You walk into a room with two informal leaders. One is friendly, transparent, always available. The other is calm, speaks little, decides quickly, and doesn't over-explain. When the second one speaks, the room goes quiet. Not because he yelled, but because there's implied consequence. Machiavelli was clear in his power engineering. It's safer to be feared than loved if you can't be both. Not hysterical fear, not terror, but fear of crossing a line. Fear of losing access, fear of being downgraded, fear of consequence. Respect is born when there's an invisible cost to disrespect. You were trained to eliminate anything that makes others uncomfortable. You learned that tension is negative, that firmness is rude, that coldness is a flaw. So you became harmless, and a harmless man doesn't need to be respected. Jung would say, you projected your aggression onto others. You call firm men arrogant. You call quiet leaders cold. But deep down, there's envy of their freedom. They don't ask for emotional permission. In a relationship, she tests again. A small provocation. Questions your priorities. Watches your reaction. Old you explains, reassures, gives details. New you looks at her. 3 seconds of silence. Short response, I know what I'm doing. And that's it. No raised voice, no threat, no report. There's tension. She senses there's a boundary. Without boundaries, there's no structure. Without structure, there's no attraction or respect. Psychologically, the human brain respects what can generate loss. If your presence doesn't imply the possibility of withdrawal, you become permanent. And what's permanent stops being valued. Controlled fear is the perception of a clear limit. It's not yelling. It's being willing to walk away. It's not intimidation. It's being capable of cutting access. Professional setting. A colleague tries to override your decision in front of the team. Old pattern. You explain better, try to convince. New pattern. You calmly interrupt. That decision's already been made. Silence. Direct eye contact. You don't argue. You state, and you hold the void. That void forces recalibration. Machiavelli would call this strength without spectacle. A ruler who punishes rarely but decisively builds reputation. One who constantly threatens becomes noise. Practical application. 1. Strategic withdrawal. If someone repeatedly crosses the line, reduce access, slower responses, less availability, less energy. No announcement, no speech, just silent behavioral change. People notice quickly when access shrinks. Practical application 2. Dry boundary statement. When there's direct disrespect, don't explain your emotions. State the boundary. Don't speak to me like that. Stop. No extra justification. No moral narrative. No explanation of why you deserve respect. You don't need to prove value to enforce a limit. Write this internally. I set boundaries without guilt. True validation comes when you realize you always felt this, but never named it. Strategic freedom begins when you understand that respect isn't a reward for kindness. It's a consequence of structure. Controlled fear doesn't destroy relationships. It organizes them. Without it, you become open territory, and open territory gets invaded. Machiavelli didn't defend random cruelty. He defended calculation, precise action, clear consequence. You don't need to be cruel. You need to be impossible to ignore. Truth alone doesn't create respect. Truth backed by consequence does. Now we enter the final law, the most uncomfortable one, because it requires abandoning the need to be understood. The predictable man dies socially first. Predictability is comfort for others, and excessive comfort leads to devaluation. When your reactions are known, your limits mapped, your emotions anticipated, and your decisions follow a fixed pattern, you stop generating strategic tension. Without tension, there's no calculation. Without calculation, there's no respect. Machiavelli understood that power requires partial opacity. A ruler who is completely transparent is easily manipulated, not because he's weak, but because his internal structure is accessible. Total accessibility eliminates mystery. No mystery reduces caution. Reduced caution invites testing. Frequent testing erodes authority. Unreadability doesn't mean inconsistency, it means emotional unpredictability. You don't react automatically. You choose when to react. You choose how much to reveal. You choose what remains unclear. The predictable man operates on reflex. The sovereign man operates on calculation. Jung described integration as the ability to contain opposing impulses without fragmenting. That creates psychic density. Psychic density creates presence. Presence creates involuntary silence around you. Unreadability is born when your energy doesn't reveal immediate intention. Most men confuse authenticity with full exposure. Authenticity is internal coherence. Exposure is unrestricted data. When you reveal everything you think, feel, and plan, you provide enough data for others to adjust their behavior at your expense. Power is informational asymmetry. The less people know about you, the more carefully they move. The more they know, the more confidently they step. Your emotional patterns are your most exploitable points. If you always react to disrespect by explaining, they'll exploit that. If you always react to distance by chasing, they'll provoke it. If you always react to criticism by justifying, they'll apply pressure. Unreadability requires 3 pillars. First, reaction control. Insert conscious delay between stimulus and response. Delay disrupts automatic reading. Disrupted reading restores uncertainty. Second, information economy. Share intention only when necessary. Don't announce moves. Don't reveal plans before execution. Third, strategic variation. Not always available. Not always unavailable. Not always silent. Not always long responses. Fixed patterns create a map. A map creates access. Access reduces hierarchy. Machiavelli didn't advocate behavioral chaos. He advocated a reputation for unpredictable capacity for action. The mere possibility of a firm response changes how others behave. When people aren't sure how you'll react, they operate more carefully. Care is implicit recognition of power. Unreadability also protects your psychic energy. You stop reacting to prove something. You act only when there's strategic interest. That reduces wear, reduces validation needs, reduces emotional exposure. Here's the truth few tolerate. If you are completely understandable, you are completely manageable. The manageable man is useful, and the useful man can be discarded. The unreadable man requires negotiation. Final validation comes when you realize you always felt discomfort with being fully exposed. It wasn't paranoia, it was intuition of self-preservation. Strategic freedom begins when you accept you don't need to be understood by everyone. You're not here to be decoded, you're here to operate. The identity that dies is the man who is too transparent, too predictable, too available. The identity that's born is the dense, contained, calculated man. The courtroom loses power when it can't read the defendant. And the man who can't be read can't be easily judged. Close your eyes for a second. Feel what died here. The man who needed to be understood died. The man who over-explained died. The man who confused kindness with safety died. The predictable, manageable, comfortable man died. He was accepted, but never feared. He was heard, but rarely calculated. He lived in the courtroom, waiting for a verdict, adjusting posture, cleaning his image. He needed the room to feel solid. Now breathe. What's born is different. The man who holds silence without collapsing. The man who doesn't cross the line of moral self-defense. The man who refuses the accusatory frame. The man who integrates his shadow without apologizing for existing. He doesn't react by reflex. He chooses by calculation. He understands what Machiavelli already knew. Respect isn't a reward for purity, it's a consequence of structure. He understands what Jung revealed. The shadow denied becomes weakness. The shadow integrated becomes presence. From now on, you don't enter rooms seeking invisible approval. You enter to set the rhythm. You don't rush to explain intention. You observe who tries to judge you. You don't soften your strength to maintain others' comfort. You allow tension. You don't become cruel. You become unavoidable. There's a moment in a man's life when he decides, do I keep being understood or do I start being respected? Not everyone will like your shift. Some will feel discomfort. Others will try to trigger the old version of you. Some will say, you changed? Yes, you changed because you saw the invisible line and decided never to cross it again. Sovereignty begins when you tolerate being misunderstood. Power begins when you stop justifying yourself. Presence is born when you integrate your shadow and accept the psychological cost of firmness. That's the price. Fewer easy applause moments, heavier silence, fewer long explanations, shorter decisions. But in exchange, you gain something rare. Weight. And men with weight don't need to speak loudly. They speak little. And when they speak, the room adjusts. Lock this in internally. I don't explain myself to survive. I hold my ground to govern. From now on, you don't live in the courtroom. You build it. And whoever crosses your line learns. No announcement, no spectacle, no speech, just structure. That's the decree. Become unreadable, or accept dying socially in silence. Conclusion. If you made it this far, it's because some part of you was already tired of living on autopilot, tired of over-explaining, tired of softening your strength, tired of losing space without realizing it. That's not random. Not every man can look at his own pattern of symbolic submission without escaping into moral justifications. You did. And that already says something about who's emerging inside you. None of this is comfortable. It's not supposed to be. Moral self-defense feels safe. Excess explanation feels like control. Unlimited kindness feels like acceptance. But feeling is not sovereignty. Sovereignty is holding silence without anxiety, holding position without aggression, accepting that not everyone will understand, and that doesn't shake your structure. If any of these laws unsettled you, it means they hit exactly where they needed to. Transformation doesn't start when you agree, it starts when you recognize. If this expanded your perception of the game, absorb it quietly. No need to announce change. No need to prove anything. Apply, observe, adjust. Let the environment respond. Strategic men don't talk about transformation. They embody it. And if you've decided not to cross that invisible line again, something essential has already shifted. No spectacle, no applause, just structure. We move.